that causes that cancer of racism, to where you fear something that you don't understand. Which harkens back to Stevie's song "Superstition." If you look at the deeper meaning of that, when you believe in things that you don't understand, then you suffer. And the way that fear is a manipulator in perpetuating stereotypes, in perpetuating division of people, when you believe in those things and you don't even understand why you're scared of it, or why you hate it, or why you don't like something, then yes, you do suffer. It may be, you may feel justified in feeling how you do, but that suffering, that karma that revisits, it breaks you down. This is just temporary. This is just crude matter. It's, when your soul suffers, when your spirit suffers, our goal is to really just be as peaceful and as balanced as we can be. And, to have, an artist like a Stevie Wonder hold that mirror up to each and every one of us as human beings. It's like his blindness is not a handicap. It's allowed him to see the world, or experience the world on frequencies that, because we don't understand those frequencies, we suffer. And you mean to tell me that that artist is overlooked, and that book was not even thought of, was even thought about to be approached to be a part of that book, or you couldn't have just conducted a fresh interview for that? Then yeah, he's missed the point. He's too big. Jan Werner's missed the point. But like I said, getting back to why Stevie Wonder's the master, like I said, if you listen to his catalog in its entirety, it's like he never stopped. I think maybe a small, but to me it's a small criticism, because I understand the technology was designed to make things easier for him in the studio, but not saying that the songs that he has done since the 70s should not have been done, but I think if he had just maintained the status quo of the balance between regular instruments and the computers and things, I think there's certain just textures that could have benefited. Well, maybe instead of computerized drums here, maybe some real drums, or maybe some percussion, in certain spots, or something like that, some more natural percussions. But like I said, that's just a tiny criticism, because there are dozens of songs since then. To me, I get somebody like a Bruce Springsteen. I'm not a fan per se. I've heard some songs and like, okay, well, they're okay. And I get, his fan base. It's kind of this, kind of blue collar thing, working class hero thing, out of Jersey or whatever. And I get that, because like I said, everybody's broke. Doesn't matter what color you are, everybody's broke. So it's relatable on a certain level. And I get it, some of the songs, I think, it also speaks to, the Vietnam vet. But, Stevie has a song called Frontlines that's on the original Musicarium 2 album set. It was one of the newer tracks, because that was like a greatest hits thing, but it was one of the 4 newer tracks to help sell this compilation. And that speaks to the Vietnam experience to me just as eloquently as a Born in the USA or something like that. And like I said, the list can go on. There's Beautiful, Bounce Like Overjoyed, For Your Love, and again, these songs, they transcend the sort of stereotypical, romantic style ballads. They transcend that. They can be, some of those songs can easily translate to that, but then I also think that it speaks to a larger universe. It speaks to a different frequency as well. It can resonate on a different frequency as well. Um, but to me, definitely for me, one of the masters in music and his impact. I mean, somebody that was wiping out the Grammys every year, to the point to where I think that period between fulfilling his first finale and Songs in the Key of Life, I think it was Paul Simon that won that year in between, and was like, yeah, thank you, Stevie, for not putting out a record this year, because nobody stood a chance. And like I said, that was something that was universal. That wasn't just something that people in black neighborhoods were listening to. Stevie was up there in the 70s, but I think, again, because of things like MTV, and I think that distance between the 70s and now, I think some people just either forgot or they want you to forget. But music was more universal. I remember listening to, there was a station called KWK, and I can't remember if they were totally a black radio station back then. But I do remember I could hear Smokey Robinson, I could hear the Jackson 5, but I could also hear Edgar Winter's Frankenstein. And that was the jam. In fact, I remember, like, maybe not necessarily back to back, because I was, would be in the car, as a little kid, and you sitting in the back seat, and whoever was driving, your parents, your uncle, aunt, whatever, and they got the radio on, and it's KW, one of the stations, because it was KATZ, it was definitely a black station. And then, like I said, it would switch over to KWK, and like I remember, you could hear, like I said, it was Edgar Winter, it was Frankenstein, and it was Ohio Players' Funky Worm. And as a 6-year-old, I mean, I wish I was old enough then to have gone to the record store and buy those two records. But those two songs, next to any whatever Jackson 5 song was playing on, probably the Love You Save, or I don't know, about 72, I can't remember, but next to that, it was that, and plus it was, used to hear a lot of Sly and the Family Stone on there, and of course Superstition. So, but between Frankenstein and Funky Worm, to me, those were the greatest records on earth for that moment. So, you know, I think people just forgot that mixture. I think the corporations, because they're just so busy trying to appeal to demographics, that they forget how to sell to just people in general. It's like they claim they want the masses, but then they have all these focus groups to say, oh, well, this group likes this. Oh, well, that group over there likes this. Well, this race of people, they spend X amount of percent on our product, and you catering to all this other stuff. And it's like, if it's good, somebody will listen to it, because it's like, well, on the flip side of that, you listen to all of our stuff, and it's like, yeah, you think it's great, you like what you hear, and you try to emulate that, so I think people forget the more cultural exchange that the 60s and maybe some of the 70s were. And I think between that corporate takeover and, like I said, all that hate and misunderstanding about disco, and lumping all of black music into disco, is definitely a disservice, to creatives in general. But unfortunately, as time went on, like I said, we forget about the impact of a Stevie Wonder. And, I urge, if you only listen to a certain type of music, if you're only listening to a Led Zeppelin or something like that, or whatever, I think they're great too. But yeah, definitely, give Talking Book a listen to, give Innovisions a listen to, give Songs in the Key of Life a listen to, and I think you'll be all the better for it. You can integrate that into whatever it is that you like. And I mean, especially if you love the Beatles, then definitely, by all means, check out Stevie Wonder, because what he was doing in the 70s was even, I would say, even more impactful because of the way he was wiping out people at the Grammys. It was more impactful than the White Album. It was more impactful than Abbey Road, So I'd say, just give it a listen. I did, I mean, the flip side of it, I've listened to the White Album and it's great. I listened to Abbey Road and I think it's great, because I grew up on the Stevie Wonder stuff, Jackson 5, Stevie Wonder, Earth, Wind and Fire, and then later, friends of mine, they hit me to Parliament Funkadelic, but somewhere in there I got a hold of some Beatles and a hold of some Zeppelin, and it's all good. It's all music, that's what it is. So we're going to move from Stevie, and the next on our list is Carole King, and you've heard me reference Carole King earlier. Part of the songwriting team, Jerry Goffin and Carole King, they were husband and wife, and you heard me reference, I think their first breakthrough song was Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, which was done by the Shirelles. That was the one that put them as songwriters on the map. And I think with her as a songwriter, now I don't have any of her albums, but my wife has. I think maybe not all of them, but I know Tapestry is one, and I think there's like maybe 2 or 3 more albums that are in our collected collection there. But like I said, my familiarity goes well beyond her solo stuff. Like I said, the significance of Will You Love Me Tomorrow, that was sort of where music went away from that Fabian and Frankie Avalon, and it elevated rock and roll. And there's a documentary it was on PBS for a while, and it's a shame you can't get it on DVD or anything like that. I think if you contacted, oh shoot, I tried to get the VHS and they were like hella expensive. It's somewhere in Washington DC. They were really expensive, and you had to be an educator in order to purchase it. It was like, wow. But there's been other documentaries on rock and roll, but this one I know over here, like I said, it was on PBS, and it's hard to get a physical copy of. I know it was broadcast overseas and it was titled something else, but it's episode 2 of that documentary that talks about that transition from, where you had the golden age of rock and roll with the Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Elvis, and all of that, where it was, it was edgy, it was, it pushed the envelope, it was revolutionary, it was freaking people out. But then you started to get these, when they all, like I said, Elvis in the army, and Chuck Berry in jail, and Little Richard turned into religion, and all this other stuff. Then you had these sort of, where the record companies swooped in and diluted rock and roll with these Fabians and the Frankie Avalons and stuff. But it was Lieber and Stroller, like with their work with the Coasters and the Drifters, but then you had Carole King, Jerry Goffin, and the songs they were writing for the Shirelles that sort of gave rock and roll its first maturity level. So all this quote unquote snobbishness we get now with it, you know, that first mature level where it kind of went beyond being edgy, but it was like it was evolving. The sound was evolving. And again, it was capturing people. You know, it wasn't just like, oh, we're just going to write this for one segment of the audience. They were writing songs where everybody on the planet, you know, you understood. And especially you're talking about this age where women are starting to change and young women are starting to change. And the thing about, you know, gaining independence and then the beginnings of the, I don't know if you want to call it sexual revolution or whatever, but you had the beginning with the subject matter of a song like that. You know, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow? That was for then. You know, it's pretty tame now, where you just kind of, it's not even corny, but you wouldn't think of it as such a serious thing. It's just like, oh, it's just a nice set of words. It's a nice song. It's a nice way to put it. But for back then, for 1960, that was a heavy, you know, that's one of those that, you know, could have gotten, you know, like how Madonna used to get certain songs banned, or certain songs that are considered like, oh, you know, that. But like I said, it was mature. You know, the subject matter, the lyrics, it was mature in how that was handled and put across. And like I said, that's a testament to how great of a songwriter, to the point that, you know, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, they always said, hey, you know, we wanted to be the Goffin and King of England. You know, that's who they looked up to as much as they looked up to the Everly Brothers and Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry, you know, as far as like writing songs. Goffin and King were influential on them in regards to that because of songs like that. You know, probably a personal favorite of mine. They also wrote songs for the Monkees. Now I know that's a, you know, it was a TV show. It was meant to capitalize off of Beatlemania. You know, it's considered corny. They were considered not a real group, but they kind of became a real group after a while. But you couldn't ignore the level of songwriting talent involved in writing those hits when they had hits. And again, you know, Goffin and King were part of that. Pleasant Valley Sunday probably being the most popular amongst those tunes that they wrote for the Monkees. Two personal favorites of mine done by them, which was written by Goffin and King. The first one is Porpoise Song. That was a song for a movie they did called Head, which was really them trying to break out of that teeny bopper image. You know, well, we're no longer on this kids type show. We want to be taken seriously as a real band. It didn't quite work, but in the long run, when people look back on that, they kind of have more of a fondness of that film now. But that song, it's like, it's just as psychedelic as anything that was on the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour. To me, I love the drums on that song. But, you know, as a song, as a composition, the lyrics, probably not as, it's deep, but not as accessible as stuff as they've written before. You know, most of the stuff is pretty straightforward, but this is them trying to be psychedelic. But it's one of my favorite Goffin and King compositions that was done by the Monkees. And there's another song that really resonates even deeper that they've done. It's called Take a Giant Step. And the lyrics of that are so, I mean, it's metaphysical. You know, it gets into quantum physics, you know, come with me, leave yesterday behind, take a giant step outside your mind. There's no percentages in remembering the past. It's time you learn to live again at last. I mean, that's songwriting, folks. That's, you know, and to come up with something like that, you mean it. Like I said, that's why this show exists, and that's why I'm calling this The Masters, including, but not limited to, that. But, yeah, but I mean, again, Tapestry being a major album of hers, you know, and again, getting back to the impact on women, writing You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, that song, which was done by Aretha Franklin, or made famous by Aretha Franklin. Carole King did her own version, I think, you know, after that. But again, it doesn't go for a certain segment of people. You know, it's transcendent. Like I said, it's, you know, Aretha made it a universal hit. In fact, we're going to get to Aretha in just a moment, but you know, you have, again, it's a women's anthem, regardless of color. It's a woman's anthem, that song. And you know, like I said, I think, you know, the forces at work, so to speak, have done this number to where over the decades, I think some things were either forgotten or they just want you to forget. You know, that again, there was this sort of cultural exchange that was going on, or that this music, these frequencies, had more of an impact, a more positive effect on human beings than we want to remember. But definitely, I think, you know, Carole King, I know in that article, you know, it's talked about how Joni Mitchell was ignored. And like I say, I'll do a segment on her because, you know, just her influence on somebody like Prince. You know, again, if you're new to this channel, or if you're used to listening to just one type of music, like I said, if you're like one of these classic rock cats or whatever, and you're tuning in trying to figure out what's going on and what the fuss is about in all of this, you know, we're not knocking your taste or anything like that. You know, like I said, I enjoy these groups too, but if you want to understand the versatility of somebody like Prince, you know, if you're just looking at Purple Rain and thinking like, oh, that's all that he is, then you've missed it. Or if you see him playing guitar and it's just like, oh yeah, he's just trying to be Hendrix, it's only because them two brothers are black. You know, that's just all it is, and they both play guitar. Hendrix plays more blues. Prince loves the hell out of Santana. So if you listen closely, you kind of hear more of the Santana influence. In fact, you know, I think we've forgotten a lot about Santana. You know, he had that big crossover album and everything. But again, that's, you know, if you're just looking at Santana and thinking like that's all that he is, nope. You go back to the 70s, you listen to those first 4 albums, and yes, his name should be up there with a Jeff Beck. It should be up there with, you know, Jimmy Page. It should be up there with Eric Clapton. And at one point, because of Woodstock, it was. He was. You know, but again, there's people that don't want you to think about that. But like I said, if you're tuning in, trying to, you know, if you're just kind of one-dimensional on that, you know, there's a lot of people too that, even though they've heard it, there's a certain bit of programming that feels like, oh, well, Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton, they're so close to me that, oh, I can't fathom someone else being just as good. And it's like, it's music. It's music, and they wouldn't want you being one-dimensional. You know, like I said, it's, you know, Clapton has gone out of his way to go study with the greats, B.B. King and Freddie King, Albert King, Muddy Waters. He has gone out of his way to learn from them. The Stones started off as a blues cover band. You know, without the foundation of blues, your heroes wouldn't exist. And for those that are more into the metal and the death metal, I know that classical influences take place, but you still talking about rock and roll, which is a blues chord bass music, and without the blues you wouldn't have long hair, or your hair would be long but you'd be wearing tuxedos playing with the, London Philharmonic or the New York Philharmonic, or, in fact, Jimmy Page started off as a session player. If you have the Goldfinger soundtrack, yes, the James Bond Goldfinger soundtrack, that is Jimmy Page, a pre-Yardbirds, pre-Led Zeppelin, professional, classically trained guitar player there. And if it was not for blues, then he'd still be doing. In fact, the James Bond movies wouldn't even have the. It wouldn't even have that, folks. So just remember, where would you be without the blues? Where would you be? Where would you be? So, so again, back to Carole King and her influence. Definitely, to me, one of the masters. And like I said, really just off of, really, if I had never heard anything else but Take a Giant Step, for me alone, that justifies her being on my list. Like I said, I don't personally own any of the albums, but like I said, my wife has some of the solo stuff. And like I said, if it was not for that one song alone that was done by the Monkees, that Take a Giant Step, again, there's no percentage in remembering the past. It's time we learn to live again at last. Come with me, leave yesterday behind, take a giant step outside your mind. that alone right there just does it for me. So anyway, so that's Carole King, and now we're going to move on to the queen of soul herself, Aretha Franklin. Now again, you talk about that cultural exchange. She grew up in the church and had notoriety, because her dad was the big famous preacher. You kind of see, like, I don't know how you see like the T.D. Jakes on the one end, and what's the Joel Osteen, whatever. Back in the day, C.L. Franklin was the man back then, as a reverend. And her, being the daughter, she kind of came up through that, well known in the gospel circles, but then decided to go in a more secular direction and started off with Columbia Records. And there she was doing a lot of jazz stuff, a lot of jazz covers, and she was good at it, but it didn't really take, like, not a lot of people bought those records. But then she ended up over at Atlantic Records, and they knew her from the church stuff and felt like, that's the style, that's the sound. And they could have put her with the Stax band. They were, like, some of the grittiest and the greatest. You had the Booker T and the MGs, you had that rhythm section, you had the Memphis Horns, and I think they would have been effective with working with Aretha. But they sent her down to Muscle Shoals and the Fame studio down in Muscle Shoals, and those are all white musicians. But it was with that studio and those musicians that you got the, Do Right Woman, you got the, the Natural Woman, you got Never Loved a Man. That was the first breakout hit. Now, from the Stax side of things, because Atlantic was the distributor for Stax Records. Stax was, at the time, was just independent label like Motown, but just more, you know, I would say, if Motown was more Boys to Men, Stax was more Jodeci, for lack of a better comparison. Um, but Otis Redding was the one that wrote Respect, and he sang it first, but it was more of, like a civil rights. It was more of a Black Power thing, and it did okay. It had some success, but when Aretha covered it turned it from like a civil rights Black Power type thing, turned it into a woman's movement, and again, it captured all women. You see like on the old Murphy Brown TV shows, you got Candace Bergen running around either singing Respect or Natural Woman, or playing those songs. I don't know if she wasn't singing them, but playing the records, or those records would be part of the soundtrack of whatever going on in the episode and stuff. And what I didn't know until recently, just how deep her involvement with civil rights and Black Power movement. So, it was more than just like, oh, here's this phenomenal singer. This is somebody that cared about causes and was interested in certain causes, and you couldn't, putting a book together called The Masters couldn't get that voice recorded. And I get it, like I said in the previous episode, if he had just done this book and just said, hey, these are the people that I like, these are the people that I've interviewed, and I just think they're the greatest, and left it at that, I don't think anybody would have cared. We would just look at it like, of course, he's going to pick those people, whatever. But when you go out of your way to kind of backhandedly insult somebody, say that, buy into the stereotype of intelligence and articulation, and deal from that particular deck, then it's like, well, who are you? That's the ripple effect of colonization that has been, part of the eternal poison of this whole racist thing, where just because it didn't come from Rome or Greece or jolly old England, if it didn't come from there, then it's not civilized. Every culture on this planet, regardless, whether it's Native America, whether it's Africa, whether it's, somewhere in Asia or India, has contributed some of the most, or invented some of the most beautiful, practical things on this planet, and has had an equilibrium, with the planet and nature as a whole. There shouldn't be any room for this, this old John Wayne mentality, or, survival of the fittest and conquer all and dominion of this and that. That's fear leading to anger, to basically, because George Lucas borrowed all that stuff from ancient cultures anyway. I'm taking it back. The fear leads to anger and jealousy and hatred, and therefore paths to the dark side. We should be at a point, especially in the 21st century, to be beyond that. But there's still a ways to go, and you're not going to undo a lot of this stuff overnight, or you're not going to undo centuries or millennia of, stuff, crazy stuff. It's not going to be undone in just 50, 70 years time. It's still a ways to go. But it's grateful that we have all these artists, whether it's a John Lennon, Aretha Franklin, all this beautiful music. Like I said, there's I get a joy and a peacefulness listening to Stevie Wonder's Visions, and I can get a peacefulness and an enjoyment from listening to Led Zeppelin 2. You know, I can enjoy something like a Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald doing duets, as much as I can enjoy listening to, say, like a Frank Sinatra or something like that. It's a society to where, we, at one point, we didn't have a BET. There was one point, we didn't have the Jeffersons or, let alone Good Times. For all the Ozzie and Harriets and Honeymooners, and I Love Lucy, the only thing that we had was an Amos and Andy, and that is, granted, that kicked open some doors to allow a Harry Belafonte to come later, to allow a Nat King Cole to try to have a show later. But it becomes unbalanced when you have, like, oh, well, these Beatles are great, and these Led Zeppelin is great, and this is great, and Bing Crosby's great, and Frank Sinatra's great, and Dean Martin's great, and all of this stuff, and we're supposed to just blindly embrace it because you say it's great. But when we try to say, hey, remember James Brown, or Eddie Hazel is one hell of a guitar player, and the reaction is, well, what the hell is that? Then there's an unbalance there. Like, well, you don't want to embrace it because they're not Jimmy Page or whatever. It's like, no, we like it because it sounds good. That's the thing. And for a while, we thought that's what was happening, but apparently that's not the case with some folks. So, by all means, and again, you want to talk about cultural exchange, listen to Aretha Franklin's Lady Soul album. There's a certain guitar player on that album that you might know. What are some of his hits? Was it After Midnight? We gonna let it all hang out. And, oh, didn't he cover Bob Marley? I Shot the Sheriff. Or I think you remember him from that one classic guitar riff. Yeah, that dude. He's on. What's his? He's on that Aretha Franklin's Lady Soul album, playing some hellified guitar, some good guitar. Yeah, good old Eric Clapton. Yeah, so you might want to check. See, if you didn't know, if you don't know, now you know. So so definitely check out some Aretha Franklin for sure. Beyond that, let's see, one of my favorites. I have to get this on CD again, and I have to watch the documentary about this too. But Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace, that gospel album, by all means, check that out. So you want the deep, gospel, just like blues, just like country. Those are the foundations of rock and roll, or what we know now as rock and roll. So yeah, you want to take that deeper dive, and elevate a little bit. Go listen to some Amazing Grace and get lifted. Listen to that album and get lifted. Yeah, so definitely check those things out. So the next on our list is Frank Zappa, and this is an artist. I think the first time I saw this cat was on an episode of The Monkees. Actually, he's in the movie Head too, and I had never heard his music before, but just like the segment of the episode he was in of the Monkees is him and Mike Nesmith, and they kind of was switching places. Like Mike was dressed up like Frank Zappa, and Frank Zappa was dressed like Mike Nesmith. And I can't remember the conversation that took place in that episode, but to me, even then, just even as a little kid, you know, that intelligence kind of came through. Like, okay, this is a different cat than the what you know, like normal rock and roll. You know, or stereotypical rock and roll. Just a bunch of like, to me, the stereotype would be like the Who. You know, where it's just like, okay, they playing this like really heavy rock, and then they smashing up the instruments at the end. I thought like, okay, this is something a little bit different than the norm. But you know, you're a little kid, so it's not like, okay, well, where can I get some Frank Zappa records, or you know, where can I, you know, because if he was on the radio, it went right over me if he was on the radio. So I really didn't get into his music until much later, well into adulthood. But as a little kid, seeing that episode of the Monkees, then later on in the movie Head, in that one, I think kind of fast forward. Okay, then there's the thing he did with his daughter, Valley Girl, that track. There was that, and I might have seen him on TV once or twice, a little bit. And then in the 80s, with him, you know, speaking out against censorship of the records, you know, fighting against having labels or rating system put on records. And then his fight against the bootleggers as well. And I thought, and every time it's like, oh yeah, he definitely proved me right. Like, he was somebody that was different than the norm. He wasn't your stereotypical just rock dude talking about sex and drugs and just rock and roll. You know, this was a deep cat, and he had some causes, and he went behind some causes. But once I really started to listen to his music, then I was like, wow. You know, you know, he's got that sense of humor, and it's the thing that I've also heard on Parliament Funkadelic albums. It's the humor is similar in play, or the tone, I should say. It's different types of humor, you know, because it's like, you know, with Parliament Funkadelic, you know, it's black culture, it's science fiction, and you know, it's the hood. You know, so you got all those things mixed together with Parliament Funkadelic, where, you know, Frank is just like, he just goes where Frank wants to go, and but it's the same tone of humor, and you know, some of the sounds, especially, there's definitely similarity for me with the early Westbound era Funkadelic stuff and some of the more funkier, jazzier Frank Zappa stuff, like Apostrophe and Overnight Sensation, things like that. One size fits all, to me. I've heard things like where it's, you know, like Prince's Rainbow Children kind of has that tone, you know, where it's like heavy, melodic, beautiful guitar solos. So, you know, as an artist that calls his own shots, that owned his masters, lent his name behind some causes, and you know, this dude was kind of anti Rolling Stone, or maybe anti Jan Werner. There's a quote I was reading about his Frank Zappa's son Dweezil Zappa, who's just as good of a guitar player as his dad. He was saying the only thing that would have gotten me disowned by my dad is if I became a journalist for Rolling Stone. And you know, it's like, yeah, I can get that. I see that. But you know, as I've taken a deeper dive and continuing to take even deeper dive into the work of Frank Zappa, you know, as an artist, just personally, has had a tremendous influence. Every time I go deeper, if it's me checking out a certain album, if it's me looking up stuff on YouTube. I've watched the recent Zappa documentary that's out. Actually, I own it digitally. Um, yeah, I mean, he's up, like it's Prince, George Clinton, Frank Zappa. That's it. That type of artist with, prolific, lots of stuff in the vault, lots and lots of records, just prolific, just nonstop recording projects, and in the case of Prince and Frank Zappa, the versatility. Um, like I said, rock, kind of like, I don't know, maybe not too much psychedelia, but definitely rock, jazz. Um, he's done orchestral arrangements. There was a project he did, I forget which symphony orchestra he did it with, but he financed the project out of his own pocket and knew it wasn't going to make a lot of money, but he did it anyway because that's what he felt like doing. He, like I said, called his own shots, and it's very influential. So, the humor, like I said, I like a lot of, I do like some of that dark humor. I mean, I like, beyond traditional comedians. Like, I like a Red Fox, I like a Cat Williams, I like a Dave Chappelle, I like Richard Pryor. I like stand-up comedy and stuff like that. But I also like the, kind of off-color humor. I like the Monty Python stuff. The Beatles have some of that humor too that I like too, as individuals. Maybe not so much it translated on record all of the time. They were serious about the music end, but when you watch like A Hard Day's Night, or when you see them in interviews, even to this day, their individual solo interviews, they're that type of humor. It resonates with me. So so the humor for Frank Zappa, it may end up being an acquired taste for a lot of people. If you want to take a deeper dive based off of this episode, probably in the future I will do some episodes devoted to a particular album of his, and maybe try to help you sort it out. But if you want to go listen. But like I said, as far as musicians, he's had some of the best musicians. If you want to talk about, again, guitar, gods, or whatever you want to call them, but Steve Vai is definitely a name that has played with Frank Zappa. Also from the jazz side, George Duke, the greatest keyboard players ever, has played. Like I said, check out like Overnight Sensation. George Duke is one of the musicians on that as well. So there's still a lot coming out. Even though he passed in 1993, there's still a lot of stuff that the Zappa State is still putting out. So if you want to check it out, like I said, by all means, it's there. It's on streaming, or if you want to go buy the album or the CD, there's still stuff coming out all the time. So definitely check that out. And like I said, he's one of my favorites, and somebody. But like I said, he wasn't a fan of Rolling Stone magazine, so but definitely check him out, and check out his documentary if you want to find out what he's all about before you check out some of the music. But there's a lot of his music well represented in that documentary, and it's just called Zappa. And you can find it on streaming, you can buy the DVD, but definitely check it out. Alright, so now we're down to the final two. And the next on this list is Bob Dylan. And of course, Bob Dylan was one of the names name dropped for that book. But for this show, he also made my list. Because again, this is one of the few that was on that Jan Werner's book. One of the few. To me, John Lennon and Bob Dylan was enough. Like I said, maybe Bruce Springsteen to a point, but I'm not a real fan of Bono. I'm not a real fan of U2. Um, I mean, there was a couple of songs of theirs that I liked, and I get it. They started off kind of like singing about the ills of what was going on in Ireland at the time. Whether it was late '70s, early '80s. And I think that was kind of their lane. But then Bono kind of decided, oh, I'm going to step onto the world stage, and whether he's conscious of it or not, maybe like, oh, try to fill that void of John Lennon. And to me personally, it's just a personal thing, but it doesn't come across the same way. It doesn't come across. So to me, it's like, why is this dude on this list? And U2 also beat out Michael Jackson's Bad album, and also beat out Prince's Sign of the Times album for album of the year. And I think that was one of the greatest robberies. Not that I think Bad should have gotten the album of the year. I think if Prince had put a little bit more promotion statewide, stateside in the U.S., and really put out the proper singles for that, I think he would have had a better shot at getting album of the year that year. But anyway, I digress. But back to Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is definitely a legitimate contender, whether it was for that book, but definitely for this show. Definitely for this show. Yes, he's a rightful contender for this list. Again, folk music. The things that were going on in America in the early 60s, you had America getting deeper and deeper into the Vietnam War. That was starting to divide the country. You've had the civil rights movement coming to a peak, and especially with the March on Washington. And, half a dozen other major tragedies, casualties of civil rights, innocent young males, college students, both black and white. You had 4 little girls being blown up in a church. And, again, America's watching situations take place. People are marching peacefully, dogs being sicked on them, and fire hoses, and all of that. And then that was starting to divide the country and everything. And you had, for, I guess, pop music or mainstream music, you had a voice like Bob Dylan writing the songs that he has written, and especially his early, like his first few albums. And again, the Blowing in the Winds and Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Free Will and Bob Dylan, that album itself, Times They Are Changing, those songs, were very, instrumental. They were sort of the soundtrack, along with, say some of the Motown stuff too. But, his songs, when you talk about a mainstream America, his songs really resonated. They became part of the civil rights movement. Stevie Wonder, before his classic 70s period, in the mid to late 60s, he covered Blowing in the Wind. Like I said, he's also written songs about Medgar Evers. He's written songs, shining a light on Hurricane Carter's, unjustly arrested, falsely accused of murder. There were a lot of people that were rallying behind him to get released, and Bob Dylan, wrote a song about that. And even though I think he kind of tried to distance himself from that title, the voice of a generation, he had a tremendous impact. I mean, he was known as that songwriter. Everybody was covering his songs. Mr. Tambourine Man, the Byrds have done that. A lot of people of my generation. What was that movie with Michelle Pfeiffer? I forget the title of that movie. But she played the teacher in this inner city school, and she was teaching them about the importance of the lyrics of Bob Dylan and what that song Mr. Tambourine Man meant in that film. And it had that influence. The Beatles, where they had heard Bob Dylan's records, especially I think like the Free Will and Bob Dylan had a tremendous effect on them. So when they were hearing that album, they started to switch from She Loves You and Want to Hold Your Hand. They switched from that to, if you listen to things like I'm a Loser, No Reply, You Got to Hide Your Love Away, Norwegian Wood, things of that nature. The Beatles started upping their game and writing like, oh, well, we don't have to write these teeny bopper type songs anymore. This is the direction we want to go. And if it wasn't if it wasn't John being influenced by Dylan with the lyrics on some of that stuff, you can hear it in the chord changes, because they end up with more folk chord changes after, not only listening to Bob Dylan, but meeting him as well. And they would kind of, Bob, George Harrison were great friends. They wrote a song together on All Things Must Pass. I'd Have You Anytime. That's probably one of the most beautiful ballads that was written or done by George Harrison, probably right next to Something from Abbey Road. But yeah, I mean, like I said, that impact is tremendous. And then taking folk to the next level, where he switched from playing acoustic guitars to electric guitars, even though that alienated most of his fan base. But it was a creative risk that took him to the next level. And then, like I said, you had bands like the Byrds that have covered Mr. Tambourine Man, but influenced them to write songs. Even a song as simple as what's that, Sonny and Cher, Sonny Bono writing the song I Got You Babe, because that was a hook that Bob Dylan used a lot. He used Babe in a lot of his songs. I think, if I'm not mistaken, if it's not the song It Ain't Me Babe, it might be something else that Bob Dylan utilized the word babe a lot of in the song, and that even influenced something like that, which ended up being a big hit. So he was influential on songwriters, like I said, movements, whether it's protesting against Vietnam or the Vietnam War, or it's the civil rights anthems of that period. He was the catalyst for that. And like I said, I think he wants to distance himself from that, because that's a lot of pressure. You don't want. He was just trying to write songs and be as good as Woody Guthrie. He wasn't trying to save the world, not on purpose, but he was writing from what he was feeling and what he was seeing around him. But to that extent, that's as far as he wanted to take it. Where you had a John Lennon doing stuff like having bed-ins for peace and stuff like that. I don't think Dylan wanted to go quite that far. But his impact is no less felt. And like I said, it was very influential. Again, back to John Lennon. You listen to a track like, go listen to Working Class Hero, and that has Bob Dylan, written all over it, because that's what Bob was doing in the first part of the 60s. Here you have John in 1970 kind of carrying that ball with that track. But like I said, not only the voice of a generation, but very influential songwriter and artist as well. Has made some great albums. Um, Blood on the Tracks is sort of the Bob Dylan's "Hear My Dear" before "Hear My Dear" by Marvin Gaye ever existed. But again, listening to those, I enjoy both of those albums just as much. Alright, so that's Bob. And now we come to the final name on the list. And we probably wouldn't have any of these people previously on the list to talk about had it not been for the originator, the emancipator, the architect of rock and roll himself, Little Richard himself. And yes, he is all of those things. You know, people debate about who started rock and roll. You go back to blues or country, or you go back to a Louis Jordan in the late 40s. Rocket 88, Ike Turner, early 50s, pre-Elvis. But I think that was that a Sun Records too, I think. Or they may have just recorded in that studio. I can't remember. But yeah, Rocket 88. But what we've come to know as rock and roll and the effect that it had on so many artists. To me, this was the nexus point, the flash point, the Big Bang, or the final phase of what was to become rock and roll. That you really wouldn't have any of it. There'd be no Hendrix, because without a Little Richard, then there would be no band for Jimi Hendrix to play with, because there'd be no Little Richard, because without that, then Jimi Hendrix wouldn't have been able to play with Ike and Tina Turner, or maybe still, but wouldn't have only gone so far. There'd be no Isley Brothers for Jimi Hendrix to play for. There would be none of this before he would end up in New York, then eventually England to be successful. Without Little Richard, then She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah wouldn't exist, and there'd definitely be no woo, shaking of the heads and the woos. There would be no one for Paul McCartney to imitate, which would be instrumental in a lot of the Beatles' heaviest rock songs. I'm Down, Helter Skelter. The thing with black music in those days, if you were black and you had a song that ended up being very, very popular, they used to get a white artist to cover it. Thinking that, there's certain segments of the population that wouldn't buy that record because it was a black person singing it. And if you look at those old clips, go find old documentaries about rock and roll and how much it was hated. Like I said, we live in this weird world now, and you see it a lot on American Idol, where these kids audition for these things and they do these covers of Motown songs and this, and it's like, oh, this was in my parents' record collection and I want to sing this song. And you got these suburban kids trying to be as soulful as they can, and it's like, nope, it doesn't work unless you were heavily rooted in the church. And basically, in the old days, you really had to sing for your livelihood, which meant that you had to practically sing 360 days out of the year. Therefore, if you were doing it several years, like maybe 5 to 7, and this is before you even get a record deal or discovered, then at least, if nothing else, you have honed your craft to the point of perfection, to where you get your Stevie Wonders, you get your Aretha Franklins, you get your Temptations, you get your Beatles. I mean, I think the misconception of some people with the Beatles is that people think that they were overnight sensations, and they weren't. They didn't start in 1964. They weren't signed to a record deal until 1962. Their very first record was barely top 20. Their first number one technically wasn't a number one record. But after that, they started gaining momentum, England, and then the rest of Europe. And then by 64, America caught on. But to the minds of most people, they're this overnight sensation. And I think a lot of the hate derives from that, especially their earlier period. Because a lot of people want to sweep that early period under the rug and just think that Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, The White Album, and Abbey Road are the bee's knees of the Beatles. And it's really versatility and evolution, which is, you're a great artist if you have those things. If you have a beginning, middle, and end of your career, and you didn't stay in the same lane throughout that entire journey, every album sounds different than the one before, then you've really managed to accomplish something. But like I said, that's lost on these kids today, straight from the suburbs, the bedroom, the basement, the computer, to the streaming service, which is fine. But like I said, when it comes to performing or becoming an actual artist or having a longevity, then that what they call the 10,000 hours that are required for you to be great, that's what you need. You need to pay those dues to do it. But getting back to Little Richard, that, like I said, Beatles wouldn't exist had it not been for Little Richard. Elvis, it would probably still be rockabilly and maybe some impact, but Elvis wouldn't be Elvis. There would be no James Brown because there would be no Little Richard to open. I mean, there would be no, Little Richard for James Brown to open. Started off as Little Richard's opening act at one point. There's so much. Or like I said, it would be very one-dimensional. I mean, if you still had Chuck Berry, most of these bands would have a shot. But I think where you have that thread from Little Richard to James Brown to Michael Jackson and or Prince, that structure falls apart. There's one of the Lennon biographies where it's universally agreed upon that Elvis was a catalyst with Heartbreak Hotel, but John Lennon really felt that deep down he liked Little Richard better. And the fact that Paul McCartney was cutting his musical teeth because he was the best person in the Beatles to do those Little Richard songs. So when you listen to things like the Live at the BBC, and when they cover a Little Richard tune, it's always Paul that does the Little Richard tunes. John went more towards the Chuck Berry covers on those things. But without that, again, I think it would be very, very one-dimensional. But again, like I said, that flamboyance, that way of presenting yourself, to always be dressed to the nines, to always be clean, to always be sharp, to always be impressed. I think Little Richard set that standard. Not that, Duke Ellington wasn't clean, or Louis Jordan wasn't clean, or Count Basie wasn't clean and dressed sharp. But when it comes to rock and roll, the presentation, and even when, say, Little Richard moved away from the suits to the more flamboyant clothes, then you look at Jimi Hendrix, you look at Sly and the Family Stone, you look at Led Zeppelin, you look at even a band like Kiss. The way you present yourself, theatrics. Was that well, in Batman is deception and theatricality. I guess in rock and roll it's rock and roll and theatricality. David Bowie. I don't think any one of these groups or artists, black or white, without Little Richard's influence, wouldn't have had the courage to go to the next level for whatever it was, or to create, in other words, where it's okay to create your own identity. And what I mean by identity, your style, your what makes you you, as an artist, what makes you you. The Beatles opened up for Little Richard at one point. Before, this is very, I think after getting the record deal, but before Beatlemania became a thing. And yeah, he gave them some advice and talked to them, mentored them, and they listened. I think there was a story where Paul McCartney was like, yeah, this is how he taught me how to take care of my throat. If you coming down with something, this was a remedy that Little Richard had, and kept, took care of his throat. But I do believe, if nothing else, definitely the innovator and definitely an architect of rock and roll. Stage presence. He brought the energy. Tutti Frutti, Slipping and Sliding, Lucille, even a ballad like, Send Me Some Lovin', the major impact. Long Tall Sally. Like I said, going back to the covers, they would try to get a Pat Boone to cover Tutti Frutti. And like I said, if you can find those old clips, it is the corniest thing that I've ever seen in my life. It is very corny. And there was a biopic that was done about maybe 30 years ago, with Leon playing Little Richard. It was pretty good biopic, made for TV biopic. But that it covered that period where they were having Pat Boone cover Little Richard songs. Little Richard wasn't having it. So according to that biopic, he came up with Long Tall Sally, like, well, I'm going to sing a song that he cannot possibly cover. And they do this montage where Little Richard is recording Long Tall Sally, and then they cut to Pat Boone trying to cover it, and it becomes a lost cause. You got whoever the actor playing Pat Boone at the end. He's he's all wiped out. Little Richard hadn't even broken a sweat yet. But you got somebody that's young, like, and a little bit more on the ball, like a Paul McCartney, that was able to figure that out. And yeah, I think that the Beatles version of Long Tall Sally is just as energetic. I mean, Little Richard is definitely is the original, and I like it a lot. But yeah, I mean, I like the Beatles version. It's energetic. You know, they make a good job of it. And like I said, it's not an easy feat to do that. You know, like I said, maybe Prince figured it out a little bit. Um, Michael Jackson studied everybody, but I think his thing is more James Brown, Jackie Wilson, Etta James, as far as how Michael Jackson sells that song, but that energy, it's still the same. You know, and again, you know, with the way, you know, it started off the Jackson 5 really just trying to copy how Sly and the Family Stone used to dress in the beginning. But later, you know, you see Michael kind of doing the Sergeant Pepper thing with the band, and well, Hendrix too did that too with the military jackets. But yeah, I mean, his influence is felt across the board. Like I said, you David Bowie on through, like I said, even a band like Kiss, and I don't know, you know, maybe even, you know, Madonna, Lady Gaga, even, you know, that ripple effect carries. You know, it carries. You know, it, and if it wasn't a direct influence, like I said, it definitely gave courage for the next artist to, like, oh, I better up my stage presence, or bring more energy to the tracks, or bring more energy to the musicianship, and that in turn influenced the next musician, and then the next musician, and then the next artist, and then the next artist with that. So yeah, I think that if you remove Little Richard from that, then the structure falls. Rock and roll as we know it would either be radically different or virtually non-existent, or possibly would not have the longevity that, like I said, where people are only holding on to certain albums and certain acts for whatever reason. They're holding on to them for dear life. Like, you know, these are the only rock gods you can have. I don't think that would exist either. You know, it's symmetrical. You know, you can't have one without the other. And like I said, if you take away one piece, the whole structure falls. And like I said, we have to get back to that cultural exchange. You know, it's not just this music or that genre or this genre. It just is. Miles Davis wouldn't have a second career if he didn't take those chances. Like I say, urge you to take a deeper dive into Prince. You know, beyond Purple Rain for most of you. Some of us that have grown up in the 80s, like for me, it was my high school and college years. You know, I enjoyed having an artist that I could grow with. Meaning that, yeah, granted, some of the albums weren't the same as it was in the 80s, but they either still had good stuff on them, and then still there were moments where Prince could come out with an album that I enjoyed just as much as I enjoyed the 1999 album, or Sign of the Times, or Parade, or whatever was going on in the 80s. With that, like I said, you know, I grew up where, you know, like I said, radio was very accessible. You know, there were 4 black stations and just as many rock stations or whatever. But I love going up and down the dial, so you could find me listening to the 50s and 60s and oldies stuff 1 minute, but you know, the dominating music in my home, for me personally, again, it was Stevie, it was Earth, Wind and Fire, it was the Jackson 5, and then a little bit later, you know, kind of getting into 6th grade, 7th grade, then it became Parliament Funkadelic and Bootsy Collins, and, you know, but from 10 years old it was the Beatles, and then a couple of years later, some of Paul's solo stuff. So um, you know, and then growing up my house with my grandparents, it was Louis Armstrong, it was Dean Martin, it was Nat King Cole, it was the big bands, the Duke Ellingtons and the Count Basies and the Ella Fitzgeralds and stuff, so that was coming in, even though I was your typical young person, like, oh, that's old music and whatever. Some of it still resonated, and some of it, by the time I got to hear, like, it's like, oh yeah, that was great. Okay, yeah, I get it now. Um, and I have my favorites. You know, um, like I said, these podcasts started off as a Prince podcast, and I also have a show coming soon that's going to go back to that focus of Prince and the associated artists and acts. But what I wanted to do was also do a show about music I loved, and whether it'll be James Brown one day, John Lennon the next day, whether it's Public Enemy one episode and Frank Zappa the episode after that. We go all the way into jazz, we go all the way into blues, we go all the way into reggae, maybe touch on some classical music also. Like I said, it's a bit one-sided, and it's a bit unfair, and it's a bit suspect. Like I say, when you hold on to a certain group, or if there's many different types of people doing a similar genre or playing a similar instrument, that it's like there's this quick, with like, this person's really great, even if they haven't had any hits. They just got the critical acclaim. Like, this guy's really, really great. And same, different artists, it's like, same thing. Maybe not too many hits, but it's like, hey, he's doing the same type of guitar. Well, what's the problem? It's, you saying one thing, but I'm starting to think the other thing. So we gotta get past that. We gotta bulldoze through that. And like I say, it's okay to be subjective. Music is subjective. What I like, you might not like, and vice versa. But like I say, when it's kind of met with a certain type of an attitude, or when you get these sort of comments about not being intelligent, not being articulate, and like I said, you're saying one thing, but it's starting to sound like the other thing. Then, like I say, if you're going to keep trying to push positivity out, then this show will exist to keep trying to push it back in. So, I don't know. What do you think? Like I said, there's so many different artists, and like I said, I've tried to slip in a few extra ones in there in the commentary. But trust me, as Amari Music Talk goes on, just about every artist will get their episode, or we'll talk about their album or concert or whatever impact that they may have had. And like I said, intelligence, it's from the other realm. There's no one type of intelligence, and there's more than one way to articulate something. And who says it has to be the King's English, or it has to be because you got a PhD from Harvard, or because you've introduced classical overtones in it, or undertones, or Aeolian cadences, whatever the heck they are. John Lennon thinks they're exotic birds. I'll go with that too. Um, you know, like I said, every culture has brought something unique, and I think that's the key, that we need to continue under that. So long as somebody's bringing something unique to the table, then, let's celebrate it together, let's enjoy it together, and let's move forward, because the only way we're going to really survive in all of this is together, and that's, without any these so-called agendas that are being force-fed. you know, when they're still just only creating division. It's like, oh, you need to get along, but they're causing division because they're forcing things that, you know, certain people may not have the level of maturity, or they're not at the proper age yet, or whatever. You know, it's a thing that, let's just get being human first down pat, and let's relearn how to be a civilization. You know, it's more than just technology. You know, it's, you know, the art of being civil. And like I said, it's okay not to like something, but it's better to just not focus on it and just focus on what you like. But let's make some room for, like I said, if, yeah, it's cool if you want to do a book on your personal heroes and they just happen to be Lennon and Bono and Mick Jagger and all of this, then, well, guess what? I'm going to do a show and not only talk about them, but it's going to have Prince, it's going to have Stevie Wonder, it's going to have George Clinton, it's going to have Muddy Waters, it's going to have Little Richard, it's going to have James Brown, it's going to have, you know, Howlin' Wolf, you know, it's going to have Aretha Franklin, it's going to have Carole King and Joni Mitchell, and it's going to have Erykah Badu, and it's going to have Tina Marie, and the list will go on and on. Because, like the OJs say, I love music, any kind of music. So, like I say, if you enjoyed this episode, tune in next episode, and also leave me a comment. Let me know your thoughts on whatever your favorite artists are, your favorite albums by that artist, and also like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Also become a Patreon supporter. Get early access to this episode, as well as exclusive bonus content that is currently available, and more bonus content to come. Plus, if you join at the higher tiers, there'll be even more perks and incentives for you. But there's also plenty if you join at even some of the basic tiers as well. You know, sometimes even just doing the $1 or the $5 tier, that will help elevate this channel, especially also the likes. That helps. More subscribers, they help me grow this channel, and I appreciate it. So until then, create your day, create your life. Peace.